thinking about starting, but as soon as that start broadcast button turns. Okay, we are live. In a minute. Let me see us. Olivia can see us. All right, we are good to go. So I think we've got some folks joining, so we'll go ahead and get underway. Welcome everyone to the inaugural Automation Summit. I'm Stephanie Whiting, Vice President of Marketing at iMethods. We are thrilled to have you join us here today. As Trip mentioned in the welcome video, we would have loved to have all of us in Dallas together this week, but we're going to make the most of our virtual event platform and have an amazing afternoon of great content from health systems around the country who are sharing best practices and insights about how they're using automation and automated testing to do more with less. Before we get underway, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items just to ensure that you have the best possible experience with us today. First of all, ask your questions, engage with your presenters. The chat box to the window on the right will be a great place for you to do that. Each of our presenters will probably run through their entire deck before following up with Q&A at the end. Everyone has a presentation of between 25 and 30 minutes, which leaves us 15 or 20 minutes for questions. So rest assured your questions will be answered. During the presentation, if you'd like to have a larger screen view of the PowerPoint deck that's being shared, there is a maximize screen button upper left corner just above your PowerPoint screen that we're looking at now. And that will let you look at the full screen view. You can escape back to the platform and look at this view as it is at any time. And finally, because we have so much content today, we have a number of breakout sessions running simultaneously during 2 different tracks. I know you're going to want to hear it all. So rest assured, we are setting up a recording methodology that you can come back to the site at any time at your convenience and listen to the recordings for any of the sessions that have been run today. So with that, I will take a moment to welcome our keynote speaker. We're thrilled to have Antony Edwards, Chief Product Officer at Eggplant. He's going to share some insights about what's going on with Eggplant these days. Antony's been with Eggplant 8 years and has a long career of extensive enterprise software experience and mobile computing. And we are just so excited to have you with us. You've been a great friend to iMethods, so welcome, and I will hand it off to you.
Hey, thank you so much. And thank you for having me for this amazing Automation Summit. As I said, I'm Antony. I'm the Chief Product Officer of Eggplant and delighted to be here. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. So software is undeniably and massively transforming our world for the better, right? From all the usual examples, self-driving cars, smart cities, smart healthcare, all the way from personal devices to electronic medical records to medical equipment. Software's coming deeper and deeper into our lives, and that's great, right? Since it's delivering huge benefits. But for those of us who have a responsibility for ensuring the quality of software, this really raises the bar in terms of what we're doing now. Because, in the old days, if you were a tester, usually sort of 20, 25 years ago, often the implication of a defect in software wasn't so bad. It was a lot of sort of general enterprise back office system. But these days, a software defect, as we all know, can have a really big impact. And I think just to give us a feel for that and how what seem like very small defects can have big impacts, I came across a really relevant and quite tragic, to be honest, example a couple of weeks ago. I didn't know this before. The event in question happened 6 to 7 years ago. I only learned about it recently. Some of you guys may know. And it happened when a man named Thomas Eric Duncan went into the Texas Health Presbyterian Hospital. Thomas had a fever and he had some abdominal pains, but nothing too serious. He was checked out by a physician, and after being checked out, he was just diagnosed as suffering from a seasonal flu, and he was sent home. Now, unfortunately, there was a bug in that electronic health record system. which meant that the physician didn't see a bunch of data that they should have seen. Interestingly, if it had have been a nurse that checked out Thomas rather than a physician, this wouldn't have happened. Now, a key bit of information that the physician didn't see was that Thomas had recently returned from Liberia, which at that time was a hotspot for Ebola virus. And Thomas is actually quite well known today because he was USA's Ebola patient zero. He was the first diagnosed case of Ebola in the United States. And unfortunately, he came into hospital, but he was sent home. Now, Thomas tragically died a few days later, infected a large group of people before that time. And I just think, when you think about something like an EHR system, and you think about all the different workflows, all the information it provides, you can see that bug happening. You can see that slipping through the testing we do today, but it's so critical and can have such big impacts, and that's a responsibility we all have now. And of course, while this is happening, while software is coming deeper and deeper into our lives, making quality so much more important, the rate of change is just continually accelerating, right? I mean, and nowhere is this more obvious than in healthcare. I mean, you look at the changes to healthcare legislation and healthcare sort of operations. I mean, this year, obviously an exceptional situation, but even all the political changes over the last 5 years to the different sort of way healthcare flows work in the United States in particular. And these legislation changes usually mean changes to the software, which all have to be rolled out quickly, which all have to be tested quickly, and the quality is just more and more important. We need to get quality at speed. So the question is, how do you do that, right? How can you deliver high quality software, higher quality than we're actually been doing in the past, but doing that even faster? And not only sort of doing testing that maybe reduces some of the more technical metrics, but software that really delights the users and drives patient outcomes at the speed of DevOps. And that's what this presentation is about. How can we get quality at speed? Because that's what we need. Now, I should say before I get into it that the approach I'm going to talk about, as you'll see, there's nothing actually healthcare specific in it. It's a general approach that is applicable over any industry, and we've tried it in lots of industries very successfully. But I think in healthcare, it's really probably more necessary than in every other industry because of the criticality of the quality of software, because of the speed of change. And I think healthcare often has this self-perception of being a bit of a laggard when it comes to IT and software testing. And I think this really needs to change. I think there's a need in healthcare, and I think there's a desire from a lot of the folks I talk to change that round so that healthcare becomes a real leader in the world, of software quality. So I'm going to start the presentation with two numbers that come from a Gartner survey, 86% and 18%. 86% is the percentage of, sorry, I should have said, these numbers come from a Gartner survey. 86% is the percentage of testers who said, we're meeting our objectives. We go to our dashboard, everything's green. Wonderful. 18% are the percentage of users who said, we're meeting the quality expectations of our users. Sorry, excuse me. Now, the first time I saw these numbers, I didn't really think much of it, I mean, it was pretty much as kind of what I'd expect, actually. And I think some of you guys might be having the same reaction as well. It's like, yeah, pretty obvious. But the more I thought about these, and the more I tried to explain them to people around me, the more it bothered me. And there are two reasons. The first one was 18%. So 82% of us still don't really know how to produce software that delights users, drives business outcomes, has good quality. Okay, that sort of means as an industry, we've not really cracked this testing thing very well, have we? So it kind of bothers me a bit that we're quite there. But then the 86% just bothers me even more, because that means that we actually don't even think that that's our job. right? If only 18% of us are achieving quality for our users, but 86% of us are meeting our objectives, what are our objectives? Because if our objectives aren't about achieving users' concept of quality and delighting them and helping them achieve whatever it is they're trying to achieve with that software, I don't really know what testing's all about anymore. And I don't think it's going to survive in a digital world. So, I mean, look at some of these quotes from kind of top consultancies, and they say, they just talk all about how user experience is so critical. But I like the one from Forrester the Best. CEOs say that UX is the top part of their testing strategy, is the most important part of their testing strategy. I mean, the most interesting thing for me there is that CEOs have an opinion on testing, right? You go back 10 years, and I'm not sure how many CEOs would have had a top priority for testing. So that's great. CEOs are starting to think testing is really important. It's something I need to care about as a CEO, and I'm going to have what I think are my priorities for testing. But it's interesting, that priority is all about user experience, and it's all about helping the company's customers, be they physicians, be they nurses, be they sort of administrative staff, achieve their objectives. But the previous slide says that the testing team aren't really bothered about that. And even if they were, they're not doing a great job of it. So why is that? That's weird, right? Customer experience is becoming more critical. CEOs are asking us to be more focused on CX, but we're not doing that. And why is that? And I think this actually goes back to some fundamental flaws in every team's testing strategy. I think, there's a lot of great stuff we do in testing today. We've learned a lot over the years, but I think there are a couple of sort of foundation assumptions we make, things that have become so obvious to us that we don't question them anymore, which actually don't make sense in the new world of digital transformation, of DevOps, of software deep in our lives, and of the importance of quality. So first thing I'm going to do now is really go into understanding what those flaws are, so that one can start to think, how might we address them? And I think to start understanding it, we need to go back about 15 years. So, picture that sort of 80s sort of fade to cloud and then fade back with silly haircuts and bright colored clothing. I should have had a change of costume. A long time ago, some of you may remember, we used to talk about verification and validation, V and V. And that's what testing was about. Testing was about V and V. Verification, I always think, meant making sure the software does what the specification said it was supposed to do. So it's almost a compliance check. Does the software comply with the spec? Validation was about ensuring that software was actually achieving the fundamental purpose for which it was created. It was helping users achieve whatever it is they're trying to achieve with the software. So I know that a lot of EHR, EMR vendors they talk a lot about the fact that, it's been proven that if physicians fill out patient records within 15 minutes of a consultation, survival rates go up. Because what most physicians do is they do a round in the hospital, a couple of hours, then they go back to their office and they fill out all the sort of patient records in one go. And that leads to errors. It leads to maybe missing details that are quite pertinent. It's not ideal. If they can fill them out within 15 minutes, survival rates go up. So that would have been a validation check in the old way of thinking, right? You would have had some sort of testing of whatever we've done, is that making physicians complete the records within the 15 minutes, right? But over the years, we've sort of redefined testing a bit to really only be about verification. So there'll probably be some of you in the crowd thinking, I've never heard of that validation thing. We would never do a sort of outcome-driven test like that. Well, exactly, right? Because testing redefined itself to say, we're only going to do verification. We're only going to ensure that the software complies with the specification. The fact that we did that at about the same time that specification stopped existing is an interesting thing, but that's another talk, so I won't go into that. Now, if we had have just done that explicitly, if we just said, right, testing, software testing is about making sure that the product complies with the specification, and we'd sort of agreed that someone else was going to do this validation thing, then actually I think we'd be in a much better position today, and the world probably would be able to produce software with excellent customer experience. Whether we'd be able to do it fast or not, I'm not quite sure, but I think we'd have better quality software from a customer experience perspective. But we didn't say that, because I think most people think if we had have tried to say that, people would have told us, no chance, boys, back to doing verification and validation. So instead, we did a bit of a trick. We invented a mythical entity called the business, which none of us ever met. We don't know who it is. You never really, I go around companies often asking, can I find the business? Who is this person, the business? I never find them. And what we did is we said, right, the business is going to create product specifications that are so detailed, so perfect, encapsulate everything about what a user would ever want to do, how they would think about it, and not just now, but predict that into the future. The business are going to produce these specifications that are so good that as long as we do verification well, we're implicitly going to be doing validation too. So we said, no, actually, test is still going to do verification and validation. We are going to ensure that there's an excellent customer experience, just with the small caveat that, but we're doing that on the assumption that as one of our inputs are these perfect specifications provided by the business, so that it can all work. Now, unfortunately, this is a really good trick because it looks beautiful on a slide. It makes a lot of logical sense. It sounds really efficient. There's just one problem with it. Oh, I've lost my place. Excuse me. There's just one problem with it, and that's that it doesn't work, right? Well, it sort of depends what your objectives are. I mean, it does work in helping the test team meet their objectives, because if we say our objective is making sure that the software complies with the specification, it helps us do that. And my reading of these numbers before is saying that 86% of teams are able to do verification pretty well. We are able to say that the software complies with the specification. But it just means that it's not very good at producing high quality customer experience, business objective software, because these specifications don't exist. And that's where we see the 18%, right? That's where that gap occurs, because we're doing verification really well, but that bridge from verification to validation, the idea of the perfect specification, just never existed, right? And you know this, every time anything comes into testing and sort of there's something we've missed from a customer experience perspective, the easy thing to do is always say, well, that wasn't in the specification. But the reality is, of course it wasn't. How could anyone write a specification that's so complete, so detailed? And by the way, for what it's worth, I don't think that this approach makes testers very happy, because most testers I talk to are really passionate about making software that delights users, that helps people achieve what they want to achieve. Most testers I talk to talk about users all the time, and they like nothing more than finding out that there's a user that really likes the quality of their software. I don't know that many testers that get super passionate about the ability to check a specification. It's an important part of the job. We definitely do it. It's key. It's intellectually interesting. But I think that this separation doesn't work for the business, and I don't think it works for their tester as well. So why doesn't it work? Well, I think in the majority of cases, most companies just never even had this entity called the business assigned to do this role. I don't think anyone was ever sort of allocated to writing these specifications. Sure, we all have product managers. Oh, my lights have gone off. The perils of being in a deserted office. So we all have product managers or product owners, but creating a specification that covers everything that may impact user experience is just far beyond what a product manager or a product owner would normally be expected to do. In fact, I think creating a specification that captures all elements of the customer experience, predicts the impact on all users, and does this within the timescales of a continuous delivery project for sure is just an impossible task. So this validation gap is a huge flaw at the center of most teams' test strategies. And as I say, is the reason that 86% of teams are able to meet their objectives, but we're not delivering for customers. Now, if you'll forgive a slight digression here, just to address the kind of pet point, there's this theory, one of these theories kicking around testing as well, is I call the unit testing fallacy. There's this idea that if you just test all the units of a bit of software, that you've effectively done product testing. So if you test all the parts, you've tested the whole. When people say this to me, I normally ask them something like, would you drive a truck over a bridge that had never been tested as a bridge? It had just been tested as, a brick and a beam and a cable. Would you drive a car that had never been tested as a car, but only as, a wheel, a steering wheel, a seat, a valve of an engine? I mean, of course not. That'd be ridiculous. But unfortunately, people do this in software. So, and it's the same fallacy, really. Basically, there's this idea that you've got some sort of architect. This is another mythical character, I think, in the sort of testing pantheon, that you have this architect that makes sure that if you just check all the units correctly, that the product as a whole works correctly. So if anyone hears this, if anyone sort of feels like this is a good strategy, please don't. You can't replace product testing by unit testing any more than you can replace validation with verification. Okay, so rant over, coming back. So we've characterized the problem a bit now, and hopefully that's resonating with people, right? We had verification, validation, we've sort of set up this path. So if you start sort of thinking, okay, so how do we address this problem? The obvious thing to do is look at that 18% and say, well, okay, what are those guys doing? So what are the 18% of companies that are able to deliver a high user experience, deliver on their user expectations? What are they doing? Are they doing anything common, or is it just random, or what's going on? And, we sort of did a survey around this. We probably went to about 300 companies, and we found, our results, by the way, correlated a lot with Gartner's. And we did find a common thread across all that 18% of companies. So normally if we were live now, I'd sort of ask the crowd to sort of shout out ideas on what they think the common factor might be, but we're not there yet. But it's fun to think about. So I'm just going to give everyone 10 seconds and have a bit of a think. I can't really get to the chat window easily, so I won't do that. But have a bit of a think about what you think might be the common factor of these 18% of companies that are able to deliver a great user experience. Cool. Well, the answer, which usually surprises people, is manual exploratory testing. So that's what these 18% of companies had in common. They all had quite advanced, quite mature, highly skilled manual exploratory testing. Now that is really interesting, right? Especially because manual testing is very sort of unfashionable these days. So what's going on there? Why is manual exploratory testing able to achieve something that all these other companies, whatever methods they were using, can't achieve? Well, to answer that, I think we need to look at how does manual exploratory testing work, and pull out just a few key things. So if you think about manual exploratory testing, it starts with a tester looking at the set of all possible journeys. Right? A manual exploratory tester is not constrained by specification or by the limitations of their test tooling or anything like that. They really start with the complete space of what could a user do. Then you get your great manual exploratory testers, and they take in a huge amount of information. You get these people who understand the product, really well. They understand how customers use the product, what they're trying to achieve. They understand the risky parts of the technology stack, maybe the third-party components that have always been a bit buggy, and they understand the development process and where it tends to work really well and where some things go wrong. Maybe the development team are great at producing really stable core components, but it's at the integrations that it's not so good. Or maybe they know that it's any time it goes back to the database that things don't work so well. They might know the feature that was rushed in at the last minute, like an hour before the sprint deadline. And they might know the developer that's new to the code base, or they might know the developer who used to work on this code base a lot, but has kind of been out of it for the last 2 years and is now coming back to it, sort of thinking they know everything, but maybe they don't. So you get these testers with all this knowledge, and they choose the key journeys they're going to test to maximize the user experience and reduce risk. And this is, apologies if I'm laboring this point a little bit, but it's really key. Because whenever I talk to manual exploratory testers about how do you choose the user journeys that you're going to execute against the system, the word they keep using over and over again is the users. They talk about their users. They talk about, oh, on the previous release, a lot of our users tried to do this and it didn't work. Or the first feedback we get from users is always this, or new users say this, or all our support cases do this. They talk about the specification as well. We talk about what's new in this release, what are the changes, because obviously that's an input on risk. They use the specification as an input, but it's not the totality of what they think about. And it's not the center. The center is customer experience, and the specification is just one of many inputs into this. And I think this is fundamental to what we need to change about testing to make it more, to improve the user experience, improve the quality, and as we'll see in a minute, to speed it up. I think we need to put customers, users, patients, physicians, nurses back at the center of testing rather than specifications. I'll also note that manual exploratory testers, they don't just look at functionality. They also look at performance and usability. Because they're respected, they're usually empowered to have an opinion beyond the specification, which often doesn't talk about performance or usability, which is interesting because if I go back to my previous example about, with an electronic medical or health record, what you're really trying to achieve is get more information more quickly, more accurately into the EHR. Performance is critical to that. Usability is critical to that. If you think about it, you think about talking to a physician and a nurse. If you ask them, hey, I noticed you started filling out that form, but then you stopped and you came back to it later. Why did you do that? I think the most likely reason you're going to hear is, oh, it was going really slow. Or it was too many fields to fill out, too complicated. It didn't work on the size of the screen. You're much more likely to hear these things than hear, oh, there was a functional defect, or maybe there was a crash, or maybe there was something went wrong here. Performance and usability are usually more important to validation than functionality, and yet verification focuses almost exclusively on functionality, because that's what's in the spec. So manual exploratory testers start with all the user journeys. They look at what's important to users, and they look at functionality, performance, and usability. And this is really key. This is what makes manual exploratory testing so important. Cool. So if user experience was all that mattered, actually, we've sort of got our answer. Everyone just needs to go away, set up a great manual exploratory testing team, and we're good. And interestingly, I think this is sort of implicitly what a lot of teams have done. I mean, it's been quite interesting. As I talk to test managers over the last few years, you'll often hear them say things like, well, we're under a lot of pressure to move to automation, but I really want to, and that's good for a lot of our testing, but I do want to keep a core of my really experienced testers, just because that seems to make the product better, right? They'd often use very casual, informal words like this. They had a feeling that they needed that core group of manual exploratory testers to ensure that the quality of the product stayed good, even in bringing automation. They couldn't articulate it, and I think what we've got here is exactly it. People had the automation in there for the bulk of the regression testing, but they had the manual exploratory testing in there to really just make sure that the user experience and do effectively the validation. So as I say, so if all we cared about was customer experience or user experience, I think we're good now. The problem is, of course, DevOps, continuous delivery, the pace of change, right? Because there's one downside of manual exploratory testing, and that's that it's just a bit slow, right? It's great, but it's slow. Or it's very expensive because you've just got an army of these people. Not that great manual exploratory testers are that easy to find. And the other problem with manual exploratory testing, it's very non-traceable, which can be a bit frustrating. It's very hard to manual exploratory testing is very much an art, because you don't really know what you did last time, so you can't sort of get into that continuous improvement mold that you can with sort of more structured disciplines. But I think it's important to realize that manual exploratory testing really is key to getting high user experience, and there's only one problem with it, and that's that it's a bit slow. Cool. And this is actually borne out in the Gartner survey that I referenced earlier, because there was another number in here that I didn't mention earlier, and that's 11%. So 11% is the percentage of teams that said they could keep up with the pace of DevOps. And really interestingly, but very much in line with what we've been talking about up until now, not a single team surveyed reported both that they could keep up with DevOps and deliver a great UX. So there was zero overlap between that 18% and that 11%, as my clumsy brick animation suggests. Now, if you just sort of got that out of the blue, you think, wow, that's really weird. I thought surely it's the people who can keep up with DevOps who have the more mature, better test practices, and therefore are more likely to delight their customers. So that could be a bit of a contradiction, but I think the framework and the kind of root causes we've found makes perfect sense to us now, because that 18% are the people using manual exploratory testing, but those folks can't keep up with the pace of DevOps. So at this point, you could start getting a bit downhearted. You could start thinking, well, does that mean we have to choose? Does that mean we have to either be good quality, high quality, or we have to be fast? Is there a fundamental kind of separation here that we can't get over, right? And I think if there's anywhere that this would be a problem, it's in healthcare, where obviously you can't compromise on quality, but we need to keep up with the new legislation, and we need to keep up with all the changes going on. How could you can't tell coronavirus to go away for a year because our testing can't keep up? Well, fortunately, the answer is, of course, not no. It is yes. Otherwise, this would be a terrible talk. But how do you do that? How do you deliver high user experience, but fast? And I think the key is to think about these terms and understand them a bit better. So if we think about manual exploratory testing, it delivers a great customer experience because of the exploratory bit. It delivers a great user experience because it's intelligent, because unlike regression testing, if you're doing exploratory testing and you find a defect, you're going to keep hunting around in that area. You're going to apply all these different patterns. So manual exploratory testing, it's the good part of it is the exploratory bit. The difficulty comes from the manual bit. Equally, automated testing, well, automated testing is a bit of a misnomer, really. It should be called automated regression testing, or actually it should be called automated functional regression test execution. I hate this term, automated testing. You see that you come across these teams that have armies of people doing automated testing, and you think, well, it doesn't look that automated. And that's because actually what we've automated is just functional regression test execution. And of course, real testing has all kinds of things around that that are different. There's test design, there's setting up test environments, there's test data management, there's deciding what to test, there's analyzing results, there's usability testing, there's performance testing, all these things that so-called automated testing doesn't come anywhere near. But anyway, automated regression testing, now it's fast because it's automated, but it's not very useful, or it's limited in its usefulness because it's just functional regression testing. So if you go through it this way, you see very clearly that, well, hang on, the good bit of manual exploratory testing is the exploratory bit, and the good bit of automated regression testing is the automated bit. So can we take the good bit from both parts, and can we get automated exploratory testing? And I think if we can do that, that allows us to deliver high quality software at speed. Now, I will say, when you sort of think about it, that kind of seems obvious. So why have we, but we've never thought about it before, I don't think. I've never come across anyone who's sort of talks to me about automated exploratory testing. In fact, I think in most of the testing world, exploratory testing has become a sort of almost, the kind of fancy way of talking about manual testing, even if that manual testing is not exploratory testing in the slightest. And I think this is a really good example of where we have some of these underlying assumptions within the testing world that are holding us back. I mean, every test strategy I ever see has a triangle in it with some layers, and everyone just sort of presents it as a truism, like it's definitely true because I can draw it in a triangle. And someone like 22 years ago now showed this somewhere, and it was great, even though we don't know who that person was, don't really know what they were trying to say. And actually, if you go into it, it doesn't seem very applicable. So if there's a sort of subtext to my talk today, I'd really say it to be, we have a lot of implicit assumptions within testing, usually combined with weak terminology, like automated testing. Testing's not automated in the slightest. There's a tiny bit of it that we've automated, so stop calling it automated testing, right? Exploratory testing is exploratory testing. It's not a fancy way of saying manual testing. And when we talk about the value of manual exploratory testing, the value is really in the exploratory, and the fact is we don't know how to do it. You can't do full exploratory testing in an automated way. But I'd really encourage everyone that I think the answers to most of the problems in testing today come from questioning the assumptions and the truisms that we have. Cool. Second rant over. Well, I've been going a bit slow, so I'll speed up. So as I said, so you can achieve quality at speed, and that's all about having automated exploratory testing. And we call this customer-driven testing because it's a lot about taking input directly from customers and using it in your testing setup. Now, I'm going to go, given that I'm running a bit late, I will go through this quite quickly. So apologies for that, but hopefully it makes sense. So there are kind of 4 key elements to customer-driven testing. The first is it has to be model-based. The age of linear script-based testing, I think, has to be over. It can't scale. There's no way you can get the test coverage you need. There's no way you can automate exploratory testing, which by definition is sort of test cases you've never executed before, if you've just pre-written a bunch of linear scripts. It has to be a model-based approach where you have a model of the application from which you can auto-generate different user journeys through the application. So this model on the screen here could do about 2 billion different test cases, and that's the kind of approach you need. The second is you need a selection engine. This is a classic place where AI can help in testing. A selection engine that takes those 2 billion tests. There's no way you could get through in an evening, even on Amazon, and pick the right ones to do. This is not coverage algorithms. Whenever I talk about this, people kind of go, oh yes, we have some sort of coverage algorithm. Coverage is great, but it's a static algorithm and has no understanding of the risk of your product or what your users do. It's simply a tree algorithm that can prune, and we need to do better than that. We need algorithms that can take information from users, from your defect logs, from your development logs, learn, and then focus the testing. The third key element is feedback from real users. We need to bring production data and testing back together. We need to make sure that an input to our testing is what users have actually been doing. And we need to stop this idea of, every time we test, we just start from scratch with the specification. And the fourth key thing that we need in customer-driven testing is intelligent testers. Because all of this stuff, the feedback from real users, the AI engines, they're great at exploring, they're great at finding the details of hypotheses, but you need an intelligent tester to configure it, to point it into the right direction, and to start highlighting what the interesting variables might be. So customer-driven testing and AI and testing, which I'll talk about in a sec, is all about augmenting testers. It's, please, no one here think about automation as trying to replace testers. We lost 15 years in a silly kind of manual testing versus automated testing debate, which was massively polarized, until we eventually got to the idea of surely it's the combination. It's obvious, but we lost literally 15 years of progress in testing because of this. Let's not do it with AI. AI in testing is about augmenting testers, not about replacing them. When I talk about AI in testing, I get a lot of people kind of glaze over a bit and say, yeah, it's all hype. And, someone will show you a picture of a cyborg and you'll go, what's that got to do with testing? So I do like to talk about how AI, and give just a really practical example of how AI in testing can work. And I do this by talking through this selection engine component. So a selection engine in testing works exactly the same way as a recommendation engine on Amazon. Right? The selection engine is effectively a recommendation engine for test cases. So how does a selection engine work for those who don't know? Well, basically, in the world of books, so an easy example, and then go into testing, you get a big bunch of books, 1 million books, and you have the properties of them. Who's the author? What's the genre length? Year part, all sorts of stuff. You then gather a whole lot of information about the kinds of books that a person likes. So what are the common authors? What length of book do they like? You basically use these categories and understand the different weightings. You probably use the rating from the user as well. So you have a big set of books. They all have properties. You look at the books that a user has, a person has selected, and how they've rated those books. You then put that into the AI engine, which is a neural network. It decides how important are each of these factors. Is it the author that's most important, or is it the length? So it weights the different categories. It looks for the specifics that you like, and then it looks at the rest of the books and recommends the one that it thinks you're most likely to like, right? So that's how a selection engine works in books. In testing, it's exactly the same thing. Oh, Ryan. Oh, there we go. So in the testing case, the books become test cases. So rather than having a large number of books, you've got a large number of test cases. Each of those test cases has a set of properties. How likely is, how often is this user journey actually done by real users in production? How many defects, historical defects, would this test case have found? Has this test case been impacted by a recent change to the code? If so, was that code raced in at the last minute? Or was it produced, or was it submitted 3 days before the sprint deadline? Did the person making that change done it before? Is it a database change, or is it done in sort of a high-level language that's very safe? You have a whole lot of information about those test cases. You then look at the previous test cases that have been executed, including whether they found a bug or not. You look at the properties. What are the properties of test cases that find bugs? And what is the impact of that going to be on a user? The most obvious sort of finding you get in most software, especially web-based software, is that anyone who presses, any test case that involves pressing the back button and then going forward again usually finds a bug. So that'll be a pattern that you would then be a property of each of these test cases, which is there fed into the neural network. And the neural network then says, this is the test case that matches the test cases that find bugs. So that's the next one you should run. Okay, so that's how that's a kind of trying to be a real practical example of how AI really can work in testing. It's not about cyborgs pressing buttons. It's about things like recommendation engines. It's all about pattern matching. But there's huge data. There's loads of patterns, and not just in test case selection, but in test case generation, in test code generation, in results analysis, in defect classification. And you can see that this basic selection engine principle can be applied across all those different places in testing. And we can start automating genuinely more and more of testing. So apologies, I sped up a bit towards the end there. Hopefully that made sense. But in the end, there's really just 4 things I want everyone to take away from this presentation today. The first is that testing needs to start focusing on user experience more than specification compliance. It shouldn't be, have you ticked off all the checks on the specification? It should be, is this the job of physicians, of nurses, of administrative staff better? Are they going to be able to meet their goals better with this software? And until testing does that, I think it's going down the wrong path. The second thing is that exploratory testing is the key to user experience, but manual testing can't keep up with the pace of DevOps. So exploratory testing is definitely a part of our future, but we need to get rid of quite how manual it is. And fortunately, AI and a lot of the other techniques we have today around modeling enable us to automate exploratory testing, and that's the key to delivering user experience at speed. And then the fourth one, as I said, is that as all this happens, human testers are going to be absolutely required at the center of it to guide customer-driven testing. There was a guy called Eric Siegel. He wrote the original book on kind of what we call today neural network AI. It was called Predictive Analytics. And he had 5 principles in that book. And the third principle of that book, called the induction principle, goes like this. It says, art drives science. Hypotheses seeded by human creativity and explored by machines are the most successful. I think that's a wonderful place to end this talk. Thank you very much. And I'm just going to go out of presentation mode, and I'm going to come here. I think I'm over time, but why don't I just take 2 or 3 questions? Where's my chat? I'm failing to scroll. Dave Hester's doing a lot of talking, not surprised. Dave's, I think, been answering most of my questions. I see a lot of stuff about here with keeping up with epic changes. I mean, it's a common thing we hear. It's a real challenge. But as you can see, having actually the epic changes fit into some pretty standard categories. You know, they like to change labels. They like to change background colors. They love to change menu bars. And these are the sorts of things that a good selection engine can learn. So I think that's at the beginning. There's a question here, what tools, apps are currently being used for implementing neural networks? Look, there's a load of great, I sort of put it into 2 tiers, right? When you get into AI neural networks, there are a bunch of core technology components. So the most common one is TensorFlow from Google. It's an open source project. The key is really, though, I mean, that is just a neural network. It takes quite a bit of work to then embed that and apply it to a specific problem domain. So, you know, there are some great open source AI engines around. I think Amazon, I mean, it's not open source, but it's very available. Amazon, Azure, all the big tech giants really have kind of a neural network AI engine that you can play around with. It's a lot of work to focus on a specific domain. There's a lot of training needed, but it is great. They are great fundamentals. In terms of, I think a lot of testing products are starting to play with these. I'm obviously going to say that Eggplant's amazing, super advanced, and uses these technologies in all kinds of wonderful ways. But I accept that I might be a bit biased on that. But I definitely, you know, encourage you to check out Eggplant and how it uses AI to do all these sorts of things. Cool. I'm now keeping everyone from their break, so I might stop there and hand back to you, Stephanie. But thank you once again for having me, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you, Antony. It was great content, really very informative, super interesting. So appreciate it and wish you best and enjoy your afternoon. I know it's late there in the UK, so thanks for joining us from across the pond. So everyone take a few minutes. We will meet back up at the breakout sessions in a few minutes, starting at 1:30. And then after the second round of breakout sessions, just so you all have it on your calendars, we will be having an open networking session so we can do live conversations with the group starting at 3 o'clock. So thanks again to Antony. Looking forward to seeing you all in a few minutes. Have a great afternoon.